Thank you very much, Adam, and good morning. I also would like to acknowledge that we're meeting this morning on Ngunnawal land, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And it's wonderful to see that everyone's returned. We must be doing something right. I hear that the dinner last night went off very, very well, and that the guest speaker, Wyatt Roy, is quite a hit. And so thank you for those of you who attended that. Today, of course, is the last day of this conference. I want to do a very brief recap of some of the outstanding takeaway messages that we heard yesterday. Of course, we began with John Howard, and who gave us a rather rousing and I think very inspirational speech about leadership. And some of the things that he touched on kept coming up throughout the day, particularly the issue of relationships among leaders and among the nearly led, authenticity in leadership, the fact that leadership sometimes requires you to have bold courage and be prepared to be unpopular, and it requires you to have a belief in something. He spoke very strongly about a moral compass, and I think that resonated with us all. We also ended off the day talking about the issues in Australia that we feel require leadership. Inequality being one of them, inequality in gender, inequality in race, inequality economically. We also talked about the need for leadership in refugee policy, in ageing, our ageing population, and how that is going to require a particular form of leadership as we move forward in Australia, and the need for leadership around literacy, education, health literacy, a number of things. Now today we cover a huge range of new areas. First up, of course, is national security. We have a very eminent panel of speakers, as you can see. We'll move straight into it, and I will allow the moderator to introduce our guest speakers this morning. Of course, Peter Leahy, Professor Peter Leahy, who also, as you know, is a former Chief of Army, Lieutenant General Peter Leahy. Peter.
Thank you, Virginia. You don't want to hear from me. I want to hear from them, and I'm sure you do as well, so I'm not going to take too long on this introduction. But I think the way I'd start this is to say that we've got probably the three most important leaders in the country in regards to national security with us today. Their bios are available in your pack, but we've got the Director General of Security, Duncan, the Chief of the Defence Force, Air Chief Marshal Binskin, and Jamal Rifi. Some of you may not have heard of Jamal. If you haven't, have a look at what he's doing. He's showing leadership. And as I reflected on the discussions that we went through yesterday, I introduced Jamal as the Australian newspaper, Australian of the Year. As I came to work this morning, I was thinking of the old adage that says, come the time, come the leader. And I think that's what I see of Jamal. The time is here. He's arrived as a leader. And I also thought about those personal attributes of courage that we discussed yesterday, and rather of leadership that we discussed yesterday. And one of them is courage. And in this case, it doesn't always have to be physical courage, and it's moral courage. And I think Jamal is showing that moral compass that John Howard talked about yesterday. But also initiative, something needed to be done, and teamwork, and it's working with the broader community. So we're going to hear about national security, but we've also asked the panellists to talk about their own leadership journey. So I think it's time for me to shut up and introduce the Chief of the Defence Force, Air Chief Marshal Binskin.
Peter, that's the shortest I've ever heard you speak, actually. So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for the opportunity to speak here today. What I wanted to do, and I was asked to do, was set the strategic context for the future from a security point of view of defence. And in doing so, I will throw in a few of my own views on that. Actually, a lot of this is my own views. But issues with leadership on the way as a strategic leader. And then later on in the questions I answer, I'm happy to go wherever you want to go on leadership. So first of all, if we want to look to the future and what will the world look like, which is what I've been asked to talk about, I think we just need to look at where we are currently. And so I'll just throw this up for its global operations that currently we have within defence. And it's a shot. Every star there is where we have anywhere between 1 to a couple of thousand Australian Defence Force personnel. And you can see there's a fair few in the Middle East, a lot of stars in the Middle East at the moment. But there's also stars out in the Pacific. Vanuatu, we have about 600 defence personnel currently out there on a humanitarian assistance mission. And so when we look at where we are in current operations, with 100 years of centenary of Anzac coming up, it's worthwhile looking at what's changed, at least in the last 100 years. And I'll just point out one thing just to make a point. At the moment, and last night, Number 1 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, was flying one of its last missions in Iraq. Almost 100 years ago, Number 1 Squadron was flying missions in the area of Mesopotamia and the broader Middle East. So back to the future in many ways. And in fact, as we look to the future from here, one thing I'll say to you is that anyone that can predict what's going to happen in the future, I'd like to have what they're drinking, because there's a lot going on out there, and that's what I aim to talk about with the security side of it today. So look at, first of all, the future strategic drivers that we have out there. And if I look at it for me, I've been in this job now as CDF coming up on 9 months. Now, in March last year, when it was announced I was going to be the next CDF, I had just come back from Perth as acting CDF, where we were leading a multinational task group looking for an airliner 2,500 kilometres off the west coast of WA. And that brought countries like Japan, China, Korea, Australia, UK, US, New Zealand, and I probably missed a couple in there, Malaysia, Singapore, together searching for an airline. Now, you wouldn't have thought that those countries would have been coming together a month before that. Just after I took over, we were looking to re-engage back in the Middle East. We sent an air task group in, we've sent special forces in, and we're currently looking at the finalisation of a deployment to train Iraqi security forces. We're in Ukraine, supporting Dutch and Australian Federal Police personnel searching for remains and wreckage of an airline that had been shot down by Russian separatists. And then towards the end of the year, we'd intercepted and we were shadowing a Russian surface task group in the Coral Sea. Now, if anyone had told me that in March, I would have definitely said, well, there's no way you could predict that was going to come up in the future. But that's the way it has played out. And so for me as a strategic leader, the biggest lesson I've taken out of that is you've got to have a broad perspective on life. You can't go down predetermined paths in the way you may approach this. And in fact, it's interesting the summary that Virginia just gave of John Howard in his talk yesterday are the exact things that I agree you take into leadership in this environment. It's relationships, it's all about relationships, and it's all about being you. So as a future leader, when you look at us speaking, you look at John Howard speaking, or you look at others that you may see as leaders in the community, learn from them, learn their traits, learn from the good leaders, learn from the bad leaders that you run into, but you can't be them as a leader. You need to take those lessons for yourself and do it yourself, especially in Australia, where people smell someone who's false a mile away. And so you can't put it on. You've got to be your own leader. So with that, looking into the future here, the future security environment, what do I see facing us out there? Well, first of all, you've got the enduring security challenges, and they're the obvious ones at the moment around the nearer region. We often talk now about the Indo-Pacific as being a system, and it is. If you look at it for Australia, over 90% by volume of our trade comes by sea, over 75% by value comes by sea. We're an island nation, we're at the bottom of the world here. That has its advantages, but it means that we've got a system that we're a part of that we rely on very heavily, and it needs to be secure, a secure system for us to maintain our prosperity, as the prosperity of the region. So enduring security challenges we see, obviously see the Korean Peninsula has been a enduring security challenge, and then as you come down through the East China Sea, South China Sea into the region, the ongoing and growing territorial disputes over lots of small islands out there is something that we watch, and we watch very closely. You look at the increasing economic prosperity of the region. Now, there's not an arms race out there, but with economic prosperity comes nations that are willing to invest more in their security. So from my side, you're seeing increased technology coming into the region, military is growing and growing in confidence and growing in capability, and that's something we watch. You've got unstable countries in need of support. Now, these aren't unstable in the traditional ways that you might think, although there's a few areas that we do watch. The instability for some is economic. A lot of countries are quite small, and therefore their economic security, their economic viability is questionable sometimes, and they're always working to maintain that viability. And then also environmental security. There's a couple of nations out there in the Southwest Pacific that if global warming keeps continuing the way it does, in about 60 to 70 years might not even exist. And therefore they're security challenges that we need to keep an eye on as well. And then you have the non-state threats. You have piracy, not as big as it was a couple of years ago, but piracy over off Somalia, Yemen, those areas over there. Piracy in the nearer region, which has been combated fairly well. You've got illegal immigrants and what that might do for our security. And then you also have the extremists, whether they be regional extremists or more broadly through the Middle East. And while they're non-state threats, they cause state-to-state tensions. And if you look at the list there, you can see with illegal immigrants, that has caused state-to-state tension and issues with relationships, and the extremists, because they know no borders, so they cross borders and therefore they bring states together that have to talk about it, or states together in dispute on how that should be handled. And then large-scale natural disasters. I mean, from the Aceh response that we did after the tsunami, through to Pakistan, through to Japan, through to Christchurch, to the Philippines, through to Vanuatu, where we are today. So there's going to be no decrease in those large-scale natural disasters, I don't think, in the future. So you put all that together, it's a pretty complex environment that we work in, and that we have to look to be able to address into the future. And with that, the ADF is more and more at the forefront of any whole-of-government response. We might not have the lead. We didn't have the lead with the Ukraine. We don't actually have the lead in Vanuatu on those humanitarian assistance operations, but we're at the forefront. We have the ability to get people there quite quickly. We have a lot of security knowledge. We get the whole picture and intelligence that we can help put into the protection of our people. But regardless of where we sit, we seem to be at the forefront of most whole-of-government responses in regional areas. Women, peace and security. This is becoming more and more prominent in everyone's thinking around the globe. But I've got to tell you, there's a lot of people admiring the problem, and not as many people as I would like looking to address the issue. For defence, this is at the forefront of our minds whenever we do operations or we're preparing for the future. We're looking at equalising or improving the gender diversity that we have in defence at the moment. When we consider operations, we always consider the gender aspect, because whenever we step into a region, whether it's a natural disaster or a security issue that we're stepping into, guaranteed women and children have had a disproportionate effect on them. So we need to factor that into our thinking and how we design our future force. And for future leaders, for you, it's good to see so many women in the room. But when I picked up the agenda for this, I didn't see one area that actually focused on that. And I actually think we need to do that more, because it is something we need to address more and more into the future. Not a shot at those that came up with the agenda, but it's just, you should have spoken longer. And then government and community expectations is a big one for us. We are a part of the community. The government expects us to be very quick in our responses, whether it's to a flood in Queensland, a fire in Victoria, Western Australia recently. The government expects us to be there to help support the community organisations. The Australian community expects us to be there. A couple of weeks ago, we flew into a little school called Byfield School, just north of Yeppoon, where they'd been very heavily hit by the cyclone that went through there. And talking to my soldiers that were there, they said they were the first ones in response. No one had been there in the 3 days after the cyclone, and so the first thing they got was, "Where have you been?" And then quickly, within 15 minutes, the community was working with the army, and they were starting to clean up. So There's a small community there that really valued defence being there, and I run into that around everywhere I go. And in Vanuatu the other day, exactly the same. So government and community expectations of us are quite high. In our future reforms and how we continue to develop the Defence Force, prominent in our mind is while we are part of the community and our people are out there refereeing soccer games at parent-teacher nights, burning sausages outside Bunnings on a Saturday, all that, there is no doubt that the community expects us while we're a part of the community to actually have our conduct above community standards, and there is no debate on that. And so therefore we are driving a huge cultural reform in defence, which takes a lot of strong leadership and a lot of persistence to drive through. You've seen a few of those out. Dave Morrison had a video out on YouTube a couple of years ago. That's quite prominent. What I will say to you is that's across the board in the senior leadership at the moment. So with that, there's a lot in the security space shaping the future. As I said, the big thing for me as a leader is I can't guarantee what risk or what threat's going to pop up. We've got to make sure that we are balanced as a force right across the board. I've got a broad set of leaders that, regardless of what government asks of us, that we can continue to deliver. Anyone that wants to join, it's a dynamic environment, and I can offer leadership prospects and leadership opportunities out there for you. So thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Peter, could I first of all thank you and the organisers for the very kind invitation to be here this morning. Could I also compliment you and the university for the concept of gathering such a group together to address what I regard as an absolutely critical issue for the future of our country, that is leadership in the national security space. This has been a favourite subject of mine for many years, and having been involved at a very senior level in national security leadership, I've come to understand the criticality and indeed the difficulty of that sort of leadership. Now, I need to correct something that the Chief of the Defence Force just said. Mark Binskin shared that the 1st Squadron, 1 Squadron RAAF, has just finished its last mission and in the Middle East, and of course 100 years ago the 1st Squadron was in Mesopotamia, completing its first missions. But General Leahy and I, as two former Army officers, would like to point out that, of course, the 1st Squadron was actually in the Army Air Corps. It wasn't in the Air Force at all. So I mean, you walked right into that, Mark. I'm sorry. Look, I want to talk about a couple of things this morning. First of all, the issue of national security planning, which was one of the subjects we were asked to address, and sort of how that works. And my experience in that area. Secondly, I want to talk about intelligence in a more theoretical kind of way. What is intelligence? What does it contribute? Thirdly, I'd like to talk about my own organisation, ASIO, and then I'll make a few concluding remarks about leadership. I'll come back to that central theme. On the matter of national security planning, if you can imagine a Venn diagram with 3 circles intersecting, and those 3 circles contain what I regard as the 3 pillars of national security planning and policy. The first one is foreign policy, the second one is defence policy, and the third one is security policy. And if you can imagine those 3 intersecting circles, where they intersect is the actual nub of national security, but each one of them is a major pillar upon which our national security rests. Now, in the security policy area, there is a subject matter which is emerging that I think my friend Jamal Rifi will address, and that is to do with social cohesion. This is about our own society, so we'll talk about that later in questions if we could. So if you accept that Venn diagram as being the kind of the way in which it all works, what we've seen in Australia over the last 15 or so years is an improvement in the way we plan for national security. It's been driven by events that have occurred to us. The East Timor deployment was the first time we had actually led a coalition, so there was a whole bunch of work that was done by a number of us here at the desk around that time to lead a coalition. It was new, cutting new ground. Then we went in after 9/11 to a whole series of reforms in our own community to build up our security. So there was a whole bunch of domestic stuff, particularly in the aviation sector. Then we had, of course, deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, where we were an active member of a coalition. We've had border security issues, as you know. There's a whole raft of things that have confronted us that have forced the country's planners to actually get reasonably good at it. Now, we're still not, in my view, perfect, but we are an awful lot better than we were 15 years ago. That also has impacted the intelligence issue, and I'll come to that in a moment. What it has required us to do is to integrate better. And certainly if you look at the intelligence community, my own community now, ASIO, ACIS and ONA, the three non-defence agencies, the Australian Signals Directorate, the Australian Geospatial Organisation and the Defence Intelligence Organisation, those three that are inside defence, so 6 agencies, we are integrated in a way that we never were in the past. We've got people that are working in each other's organisations, we've got complete slabs of one another's organisation working in our own space. I have the Australian Cyber Security Centre, which is largely an ASD, a defence organisation, working inside my building. So that's the sort of degree of integration that we enjoy currently. The government is all, and by that I don't mean the political government, I mean government in the broad, that's including the officials, has a far more sophisticated understanding now of national security and intelligence than they did 15 years ago. And of course, with that sophistication has now become a greater demand for intelligence. National security requires risk planning, and I think those of you who have been involved in any consideration of risk would understand that it's all to do with probability multiplied by consequence. So it's the likelihood versus consequence. And if you have high on both those counts, you've got a problem. If you've got a high probability and a high consequence, then you need to be paying a lot of attention to that. If you have a high probability and a low consequence, then you pay some attention to it. If you have low probability and low consequence, you might pay very little attention depending on how many resources you have. But that issue of managing risk is central to national security planning. Let me talk about intelligence specifically now. It has become increasingly a tool, a useful tool for government when making decisions. As I mentioned, the government has become far more sophisticated in its understanding and its use of intelligence, and it has become an incredibly central tool. There are a few challenges here. There is a requirement increasingly to be predictive. This is a big challenge. Globalisation, the media cycle, the acceleration of life in general has caused governments to need to be in front of the game. It's a constant challenge. And intelligence is one of the tools that might give some sort of indication of what is to come. So it's become highly attractive and relevant to governments. Sir David Omand, who is a distinguished British practitioner in the national security space, has written a book, and I commend it to you. It's called Securing the State. David Omand, O-M-A-N-D. Securing the State. It's got a wonderful summary in there of what intelligence is. He, among others, remind us, and we all are probably aware of this, that intelligence is a combination of art and science. To a degree it's a science, you can be reasonably precise. To a degree it's art, it becomes more of a judgment issue. He also reminded us in this book that we have two kinds of problems. One are mysteries and the other are secrets. Mysteries are those kind of things to which there is no answer that can be found by intelligence. A mystery might be what was in Kim Jong-un's mind this morning when he got out of bed. Now, nobody will actually know that. But if I ask you what is the range of a particular cruise missile, there is an answer to that, but it might be a secret. That is achievable, the answer to that is achievable through intelligence. You would start looking for that secret, but you'd be wasting your time looking for a mystery. So we need to be very careful where we put our resources. Let me talk for a moment about intelligence failure. It has often been a curiosity to me that if somebody robs a bank, it's not a failure of policing, it's just a crime. But if there is a terrorist attack, it's, as there was, say, in London in 2005, 2007, they become intelligence failures. Immediately, there's a cry, it's an intelligence failure. And yet a bank robbery is not a law enforcement failure, it's just a crime. That's a problem for us. We have to live with that and we have to manage it. But I just want to make you aware of that is the instant cry. Now, of course, every time there is a terrorist attack or some incident where intelligence has been involved, then we do go into a frenzy of self-examination to see whether we had done the right thing, whether we knew what we should have known, and so forth. That's obvious. But I just want to make that point. Investment in intelligence, the government has invested very heavily. It's about a $1.5 billion industry, if you like, in this city. It's about $1.5 billion given over to all of the security agencies, and another $600 million was allocated in the last budget to address specifically the matter of foreign fighters. And a substantial slab of that money came to my own organisation, to ASIO. So the bottom line is it doesn't come cheap. Growth, my own organisation in a couple of years' time, probably the year after next, will be about 3 times the size that it was in 2004. So that's the sort of growth path that you see going up, and that is because of demand. Let me talk now just for a moment about the issue of leadership, which was sort of where we began. It is my personal view, and unfortunately the people in my organisation are sick to death hearing this, that the first job of any leader, no matter where you are, is to create atmosphere. So just reflect on that. The first job of any leader, in my view, is to create atmosphere. If you come to work and you're grumpy and so forth, then everybody will be grumpy. If you come to work and you're reasonably positive and happy, then everybody will be positive and happy. You have an enormous influence over the atmospherics in a workplace, and you need to create atmosphere. You will drive the atmosphere in your organisation. The issue of courage we talked about. You talked about it last night. I assume that John Howard would have talked about it. He had some exposure to that particular issue during his life as a national leader. Collegiality is another big factor. Certainly within the national security community, we at the sort of top of the organisation have known one another for many, many years. You know, we have long relationships. Peter Leahy and I have a 40-something year relationship. You know, we were young 18-year-olds when we first met. Binny and I have been working together for, you know, best part of a couple of decades. So it is a very collegial arrangement, and not that there's not stresses and strains between the leaders from time to time, but you need to make sure you always fall back on that collegiality. You require robustness. You know, you can't just be a wilting flower. It requires robustness. You need time out to think. You know, you can become so busy that you just forget to think. So there is a desperate need for leaders to take some reflective time. You need to stand next to the biggest problem. This is something that you know, I think you do need to reflect on. If there is a big problem in your organisation, you as the leader need to be standing beside it. You can't just sort of leave that to others. It becomes very much the art of the possible as opposed to what you would actually like. You need to realise what can be done. I do recall years ago when Kevin Rudd first came into office, in fact the morning after he was elected, I made the pilgrimage up to Brisbane for the incoming government brief, and I remember pushing across the desk to him this enormous file on how to create a Department of Homeland Security. I thought it was the most brilliant idea that I'd ever seen, because I'd actually written it. It was a wonderful piece of work. Pushed it across the desk to him, and he, through his sort of, you know, looked at it and pushed it back across the desk at me and said, look, I think we might study this. And I realised then that, you know, if we studied it, we'd never have one, and that in fact is true. But he realised that it was the art of what was possible as opposed to, you know, what I would have actually liked. So I think we need to be conscious of that. Give your junior leaders space. If you find yourself in a leadership position where you are leading leaders, make sure you've given some space to those that are below you in the pecking order, because they need to practice their art. They need to perfect their art as leaders, so don't squeeze them out. My final point, and I'll finish on a similar note to Mark Binskin, it's not without comment that there are sort of 4 men of a certain age up here on the stage. And yet when I look around the room here, I see an astonishingly large number of young women. We in the national security space desperately need more young women, and we need women in leadership positions more than we have. My own organisation's making a fair fist of it. We're not good enough yet, But one of my deputies is a woman, and there are increasing numbers of women coming up through the system. But I would encourage all of you, men or women in this room, to consider the national security space as somewhere where you might make a major contribution to Australia. Peter, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Good morning, class. Well, I'm used to speak at high school level. I used to go to the local area in Canterbury, Bankstown, in school assemblies, talk to them about what they can do in their life and how they can achieve through education, through sport, and to improve their quality of life. Now, here I am speaking about future leaders of this country. And we're talking about leadership and talking about national security. And as you see, that I'm the last of the speakers because I'm the lowest of the rank. But we are complementing each other because what they do at policy level, it's how it's going to impact on everyday's women's life in the street of, our nation. And we're complementing each other. So I think it's actually what I'm doing in my own way is complementing what they're doing in their own strategic thinking. And I'm not that strategic in my thinking at all. So you would need to put some effort to understand my message I'm going to try to send to you, and which is very simple. First of all, if you need to be in leadership, you would need to be convinced that you are going to make a difference. And that difference can be, in my own way, how I make that difference is, as the president of the Lakemba Sports Club, which is coined it as the Lakemba Ruse, we were making a difference because we were getting people out from the street to play sport. And we had 5 teams, then 7 teams, and 22 teams. But it became too expensive. We just couldn't afford it. But we made a big difference to many people's life. Same thing, I felt that we can make a difference when, after the Cronulla riots, I felt the best way to do is to get 17 young boys and girls from the Australian Muslims community to train as surf lifesavers and to patrol the beaches of Cronulla. To make a difference, I also felt that through Scott Morrison and Jason Clare, one Liberal, one Labor, one from Cronulla, one from Bankstown, they came together and they got a group of young people from the Shire and from Bankstown, and we walked the Kokoda track. We did make a lot of difference there. But ultimately, from my own way, I sponsored and taken an Aboriginal group to Lebanon in 2004. They all called them the Red Indian of Australia, because they never heard about Aboriginal group. But they enjoyed it so much, the Aborigines and the Lebanese, so I had to take them again in 2009, and that was very costly. Why I ended up here? Because I had a fear within myself. And the fear at that time was when we also Khalid Sharif's son holding that severed head in front of the Australian newspaper. And I was fearful that we as Australian Muslims community will be seen as condoning such an action. Or the Australian Muslims community may be seen as a risk to this nation, while in my view, that we are a solution to this, and we are not at risk. We don't cause risk. Actually, we are part of fabric of this society. So it was my fear that drove me to go and speak against all this atrocity that is taking place in the Middle East. Then I received a death threat, and I was even more fearful. But then you have to make that decision. Are you gonna allow fear to paralyze you or to drive you further? Now, I couldn't make that decisions myself. I had to speak with my family because it affected my wife and my kids. They had that same conviction that I had, and they said, no, you go ahead and you continue what you're doing, and we cope with it as it comes. So fear is a very good and motivating force, but it can paralyze you. Too much of it or too little, it's the way how you use it and how you further your life in terms of your leadership and your message. But most importantly, we all heard White last night and how he spoke, and he gave us all talk about leadership and conviction, innovations and vision. In my life, I'm married, I have 5 kids, and I've gone through all this, and I'll tell you one thing. If you want to be in a good leadership role, and I've told White that last night, you have to choose your partner very carefully because she can make you or break you. And I was very fortunate because I was surrounded by very strong women in my household. And they have supported me, and that's why I'm here to talk to you right now. And let me tell you, if they have not supported me, I would have stayed at home and in my surgery, and I wouldn't be coming to talk to you right now. And leadership, also, if you want to play some leadership role, you need to realize there is no money in it. You would lose a lot of money, but also you would lose some weight, so which is not bad. For me to be here, I have to close my surgery, and I had to travel here, and I had to pay my own fare and my own accommodations last night in this lovely hotel, even though that probably I should ask for a refund because I couldn't sleep last night. Not their bed was terrible, but I can come in and to front you here to talk to you. It's something plays on my mind. It's not easy for someone like me. But I gladly accepted to come in here because I have views and I want my views to be heard. And Peter gave me that chance. So here I am. I knew that I wasn't going to sleep. I knew I was going to close my surgery. It cost me money. But for me to send you this message, I reckon it is important. It is worth it. And if I can make a difference in the way you are thinking, and mainly in this context of national security, and how you are thinking about the value and the role of the Australian Muslims community, I reckon I would have achieved my goal. I thought I'm not going to say any jokes, but James Stevens last night, he looked after me. Thank you, James. And I'm going to say something that happened exactly last night. There is something in New South Wales that's called the CAP, Community Awareness and Policing Program, where the New South Wales Police every year get a group of community people and take them through what a policeman has to make a decision and what policemen and police involved in different aspects of their daily life into looking after all of us. Yesterday, my daughter was at the Goulburn Academy. My daughter's name is Shaza, and that's her real name, by the way. She was doing this kid and how to control a car that is out of control, and she sent us a small video clip about it last night. So we watched it and everything, and my youngest son, his name is Jihad, and that's his real name, by the way. Jihad wrote on WhatsApp, saying, he said, a cop teaching a hijabi, that's me and my daughter because she wears the hijab. They're teaching a hijabi how to drive recklessly. The police force must be funding terrorism. Well, here you are, James. I said it. Now, talking about counter-terrorism, to be honest, I'll just refer you to one thing. If you look at the Prime Minister's statement about national security a couple of weeks ago, he connected the dot. It was very insightful, and he put the pieces of the puzzles together. So if you know about the threat that faces us as a nation, look at that statement. But in that statement, I'll give you my views. There was a few things that is missing. The government initiated a review in August about national security. And in the review, they have said, they recommended that they need to increase cooperation with at-risk community. And to me, at-risk community is the Australian Muslims community. And also, he made a statement and acknowledged the fact that law enforcement can't do it on their own. They need the mums and dad. They need people who are affected in our community to work collaboratively so we can achieve an outcome in counter-terrorism. But also he made a statement when he said that he wishes that the wishes the Muslim leadership will keep saying that Islam is a religion of peace, and they mean it. Well, he didn't need to say that, because there is some contradiction. First of all, let me tell you, his wishes came through a long time ago. We in the Australian Muslims community have always said that our religion is a peaceful religion, and we always meant it. And that statement, if the government need to work with at-risk community, it wasn't conducive for a good cooperation between government agencies and government in general and with the Australian Muslims community. So sometimes when you are in a position of leadership and you need to say things, sometimes it's better not to say them, because such a statement is not going to further your cause in making a real difference towards the betterment of society. And that's what we are here. But look us as a nation, and as a nation, what happened in this terrible tragedy in Martin Place, it showed how much we matured as a nation. That event was meant to tear us apart, but in reality what it did, it brought us together. Social cohesion at that time, it was at the best that I've ever seen throughout my life. So what we need to do is, at time of adversity, we need to think about how it's going to impact on social cohesion, because social cohesion is a living, breathing thing that we all need to work and nurture. And that madman, what he did, unfortunately, he played some part into strengthening that social cohesion, but we don't want this to happen, to work and to see that social cohesion is coming together. In terms of the IS, and I'm going to actually conclude very shortly, because the Islamic or so-called Islamic State are the greatest risk for the time being, because they are targeting our young people, and they are targeting not just the Australian Muslims, young people. They're targeting any vulnerable young person. And we have seen what happened with the jihadi Jake in Melbourne, very, very tragic. And a lot of young people who are depressed, who have mental issues, who have they don't belong anywhere, at the margin of society, they have been targeted right now. And why they are targeted? Because the Islamic State, they have not much support, neither in Syria nor in Iraq. They make big blunders, and they are on the waning. And before we know it, and in a very short period of time, other things are going to be in existence at all. And we would look at their ideology and at their action, and we recall in the same way as we look at the Spanish Inquisition or the Nazi Germany. because that's their place in history, and they are a footnote right now, but they're not going to be with us for too long. Thank you, and that's all.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, what a feast. How good was that? Authentic leaders telling it straight. It's your turn now to ask questions. So who has a question? Michael de Percy up the back. Second.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for the presentation. In my own family, my extended family, the borders of the nation state are actually superimposed over my family. And my question really is, to what extent are our current national security institutions at odds with multinational families? And at what point will national security become less about the nation and more about security?
Who'd like to have a go? Duncan, please.
I'm happy to respond initially to that. One of the things that I didn't say that I should have said, and I noticed that in the write-up for this particular gathering, you talk about national and international security. That distinction is now almost invisible. There is a continuum between national and international security, and the two issues are increasingly indivisible. So the effect that globalisation has had on everything else, whether it be communications or commerce or whatever, it has had exactly the same impact on the national security equation, where whatever happens here will reverberate on the other side of the globe in moments. So I think your question is a very good one. The nation state, however, in my view, will remain as the fundamental building block for the way that we organise ourselves globally for the foreseeable future. I suppose if you trace back the history over the last less than 100, probably 80 years, you've seen increased strength of international bodies, but they still remain, I don't want to use the word second fiddle, but they remain not as powerful at the end of the day as national bodies.
Let's take the second question there, thank you.
Good morning, sirs. Dr. Rifi, my name is Sarah Jane Leach. I'm from the Royal Australian Air Force. I'd like to thank you very much for your time this morning. My question is for Dr. Rifi. Sir, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the work that you do in your community and for Greater Australia. I think it's incredible and admirable, and certainly a leader in our community. What I'd like, if I may ask, if I may be so frank, is in regards to the women in the Muslim community, and if you can excuse my ignorance because I'd like to understand more. Please may you tell me a little bit more about the women in the Muslim community, what leadership roles they actually hold, because a lot of what we see in the media, we don't often see women speaking from the Muslim community in Australia. I'd like to know where they stand and if they are effective in what they do, because you speak so highly of your family and the support that you got from them, and if more can be done, if it would help at all having more women in those leadership positions in the community to assist in aiding that message.
Thank you. Definitely women play a very major role in the community life. And in this space, even in national security, I reckon they can play even much more important role. The women are the mothers and the sisters and the wives. And we have seen young people being stopped at the airport and returned to their family. We have seen men who already ended up in Syria joining the IS. They left their wives, their sisters, and their mothers in here. And they have been very much affected. And I think overall, the women in our community are better educated than the men, and they play a very active role, because by educating them or using their education to play a public role in this space, it will work very well. Except that the women at the same time in our community, they are much more skeptical about the media and some policies, and that's why they may not be at the forefront. But I know for a fact like the Muslim Women Association, they play a very good and leadership role within the communities itself. I think there is the perception that the women in the Australian Muslims community, they're not active or they're not playing leadership role. But to be honest, I know behind the scene, they are much more effective than any other men. Now, there are some religious hierarchy, and that's why this is playing a role, except that, and I'll tell you, there is a paradigm shift that the way the community is acting in this way, because we are no longer living in the Middle East, and we are no longer in a male-dominated environment. I think, to be honest, from what I have seen in terms of changes regarding domestic violence, in terms of issues within our community, women play much more important roles than what they are, given credit to. And there is maybe that perception, but for people like me who work with the community, I know the value of what they are doing, but they don't get accredited for that.
Hi, Jessica Mullins from the University of Canberra. I was just interested to know what your opinions are on the policies on dual citizenship and the implications that such policies could have on social cohesion, identity and leadership.
Well, look, I always believe the rule is a rule. And this rule as now standing, each person is actually will be allowed to have a dual citizenship. For someone like me, I see it as a strength rather than as a weakness. Because even though that geographically we live in an island at the end of the world, but as we've heard, everything is connected right now. And there is a butterfly effect. Whatever happened in the Middle East, it will probably have an impact on Australia. And because we are a nation that has many people from different backgrounds, that can be seen as a strength. In my own way, me having a Lebanese nationality and also an Australian nationality, I can play a very active role in terms of commerce, in terms of educations, in terms of national securities, and this is not a weakness, it is a strength. I believe dual citizenship, it is a right that we can actually use it for our own benefit as a nation at many levels. In terms of what's happening in the current climate, in terms of national security and stripping people from their citizenship, to be honest, once someone is actually leaves this country and go, the rule right now, they can't come back. So regardless if you take their citizenship or no citizenship, they really can't come back. And if they're gonna come back, they're gonna go for a very length time in prison. They shut the door so tight that sometimes it's not so good to shut it so tight, because some people who are over there, who wanted to come back, they really can't come back. And there is a lot of atrocities being taken place where people coming from Southeast Asia, they have been actually killed by the Islamic State because they wanted to go back to their country. I don't know about any Australian, because the Australians, they can't even think of dreaming of coming back. So.
I think we've got time for one. Wow, we've got hit up. Renee, would you like to ask the last question? Thank you.
Renee Kidson. So the security challenges that you outlined are complex in nature. So my question for the panel is on the spectrum of leadership styles that is required to influence those issues. There might be a stereotype out there that the defence and security communities utilise a command and control style of leadership. Less well understood, I think, is how the security and defence communities use a broader spectrum, and specifically collaborative leadership styles, the sorts of styles that Jamal epitomises. Could the panel speak about the spectrum of leadership styles that you think are required to have an impact with some of these big issues?
Mark, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I'll start. Watch out you don't confuse the actual action of the operation, which from a defence point of view is a command and control, from the coordination and the planning, which is whole of government. So I think Duncan put it well. There's a level of collegiality across the higher levels of government, and by government I'm not talking about the elected government, I'm talking about the government officials and the Defence Force and the security agencies. There's a level of collegiality there when we come together and we understand that everyone's treading on everyone else's turf here, but we come together, we understand what the problem is, and we look at the best approach to be able to combat it. And security is an interesting one, which is what we're here to talk about, because as we've seen, we've talked about national security and international security, and the fact is there's really a blurring of lines in that. So we all operate in different spectrums of that security environment. So therefore you can't sit there and go, that's mine or that's yours. You actually have to understand the full continuum. Then when you start to conduct the operations, then you get into the more structured command and control. But even as you do that, and probably Ukraine was the best example, where you might have AFP in the lead for that, but supported by defence, and there are skills and technical capabilities we brought to that, where in some cases we might have more the tactical lead on the ground, but always understanding who the broader leader is. And then intelligence agencies as well, depending on where you are, they have primacy. So you've got to have the ability to chop and change backwards and forwards. That has a significant maturity in the leadership in all the organisations to accept when you're chopping backwards and forwards.
Duncan Lewis, and before you answer, Duncan, I might just point out to the audience, Duncan was a Major General in the Army, Commander of our Special Forces. He then became a bureaucrat, worked as a National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, then became a diplomat as the ambassador to NATO and to Belgium. I think that was right, Duncan, is something like that. You were in Europe having a good time. Yeah. EU. Good time. And now he's back as a civilian head of one of our largest national security agencies. So Duncan's seen it all. What do you reckon?
See, I can't hold down a job, that's the problem. Or it's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, I'm not quite sure which. Yeah, just in response to that question, I could only wish that I'd had command and control for most of my time in senior appointments in the national security space. As the NSA or as the Secretary of the Department of Defence, the exercise of command and control is just something you could only dream of having, because it's all to do with building constituencies, building alliances with colleagues, getting sort of a bunch of people over the line, because you don't actually control them. And I might say, and Mark would agree with me, I'm sure here, that even within military organisations, once you get past a certain level, you're not actually into just standing up there and saying, righto, you know, we're doing this, this and this. You know, that just doesn't work. You've got very senior and responsible people that you're dealing with. And you need to lead leaders, and that doesn't rely on command and control. That's to do with you having the presence, the leadership presence, and the necessary sort of experience and intellect and commitment and all of those things to actually do it. So yeah, it's all about building constituencies.
Yeah. In fact, if I had a word, influence, you actually lead by influence. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, before I hand back to Virginia, I might just say a few words of thank you. I started by saying that I think we had the three most important people in the country in terms of national security, and I think we've seen that in spades here this morning, in terms of the policy and the operations, in terms of implementing things, but also in terms of making social cohesion. I think this has been just a marvellous session, so I thank all of you. And the things that have come out to me are really compounding on the lessons from yesterday, and again, and I can see people around the room nodding, yeah, and the people rushing to take a note down, but the sorts of things that I've observed, the environment is important. There are leaders and followers, and Jamal made that really strong point. And I think we all applaud him for his work about social cohesion and bringing this nation together. But also terms like authenticity and people who are thought leaders, people who want to make a difference, people who can communicate, and a reminder of the importance of humour it helps you talk to people, but people who can inspire, and above all, people who tell the truth. So please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you, Peter. What a rich discussion that was, and I think it's left many of us with a great deal of food for thought, and how lucky we are to have such a panel. And I've got to say, I think many words from today have touched me, but I will always remember what Jamal said about fear being a motivator. How true that is. I also am going to indulge myself for a moment and thank Mark Binskin for raising the issue of gender. Mark is, as some of you may know, a male champion of change, one of Liz Broderick's male champions of change, and has done some marvellous work in the gender area and is constantly reminding all of us, including our political leaders, that this is an important issue to consider when we're holding conferences and what have you. So thank you to all our panel. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to just take a short break to stretch your legs, but not to go outside. Stretch your legs, have a chat to the person next to you while we reconvene for our next panel. Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, I should have added in my thank you, I have been commanded by the Chief of the Defence Force, next year when we run this, there will be a discrete episode on women in leadership.